Have you ever looked at a snow-covered medieval village and wondered something oddly simple? How were the people inside those houses not freezing to death? From the outside, everything about medieval life seems cold. Tiny homes, no central heating, no electric blankets, no sealed windows, just timber, mud, stone, straw, and a fire that could go out at any time. It feels as if winter should have crept through every crack, settled into every blanket, and turned every night into a battle for survival. And yet for centuries, families lived through brutal winters in these homes. They cooked, slept, worked, raised children, and endured long seasons of snow without the kind of heating systems we now consider absolutely necessary. So what did they know that we have forgotten? The answer begins with a mistake many modern people make when imagining the past. We assume medieval homes failed because they do not look comfortable to us. We see low ceilings, dark interiors, small windows, smoke-blackened rafters, earthen floors, and thatched roofs, and we imagine misery. But medieval builders were not trying to create bright, airy, open-plan spaces. They were trying to solve a different problem entirely. They were building shelters for a world where winter could be deadly. In that world, warmth was not a luxury, it was strategy. One of the strangest things about medieval houses is that many of the features that make them seem unpleasant to us were actually part of what helped them stay warm. The small windows, for example, meant less heat escaping. The low ceilings kept warmth closer to the body instead of letting it rise and disappear into a vast open space. Thick walls of clay, daub, stone, or sod slowed the movement of cold air. Even the smoke that collected in some homes was not always seen as pure discomfort. It was a trade-off people accepted because holding heat mattered more than having the kind of ventilation we expect today. Once you begin to see the medieval house not as a failed modern house but as a survival device designed for winter, the whole picture changes. Take the size of the house. Medieval peasant homes were often compact, sometimes just one main room or a few tightly arranged spaces. That sounds poor, and often it was, but it was also efficient. A small room can be heated more easily than a large one. A single fire in the center of the room, or later in a hearth against the wall, could warm a surprisingly useful area when there was not much space to lose that heat into. A family living close together helped even more. People, after all, generate warmth. A crowded room full of sleeping bodies, cooking pots, warm bread, drying clothes, and glowing embers felt very different from an empty chamber of equal size. Heat was being made and trapped at the same time. Then there was the roof. This is where the curiosity deepens, because snow on a roof does not always mean the inside is cold. In fact, snow can help insulate. Thick thatched roof already trapped layers of air within straw or reed. Add a layer of settled snow on top, and the roof could become even better at keeping interior warmth from escaping too quickly. To us, a white roof suggests freezing conditions. To a medieval family, it could mean their home was holding its heat exactly as it should. The roof was not merely a cover against rain. It was part of the thermal defense of the house. And medieval people understood materials in a way that was intensely practical. They may not have had scientific formulas for heat transfer, but they knew what worked. Wattle and daub, for instance, sounds flimsy when reduced to a textbook phrase. Woven sticks smeared with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and dung hardly inspires confidence. Yet when properly built and maintained, it formed walls that were surprisingly good at blocking drafts. Stone, meanwhile, had its own advantages and problems. A stone house could feel cold at first, but thick masonry also stored heat. If a fire burned long enough, the structure itself could begin to hold warmth and release it gradually. Earth, straw, timber, hide, fabric, ash, and rushes, medieval households used all of them with a kind of cumulative intelligence. They did not rely on one miracle material. They layered solutions. The hearth sat at the center of all of this, both physically and emotionally. It was more than a place to burn wood. It was where food became edible, where wet clothing became dry, where tools were repaired, where stories were told, and where the day began and ended. In the cold months, the fire transformed the house from a shell into a living environment. But what is fascinating is that medieval people did not expect the entire house to be evenly warm. That modern expectation did not exist. Instead, they created zones of warmth. Near the hearth was warm, farther away was cooler. Sleeping spaces were arranged to benefit from the retained heat. Beds were enclosed, draped, layered, and protected. Benches near the fire became prime locations. Work happened where warmth could be used, not wasted. This is one of the biggest differences between medieval life and modern life. We try to heat the whole volume of a house. They try to heat the parts of life that mattered most. That is a subtle but powerful distinction. A medieval family did not need every corner equally comfortable. They needed the sleeping area survivable, the cooking area functional, and the central room warm enough for work and gathering. The rest could remain cooler. In that sense, their homes were not inefficient at all. They were targeted. Textiles made those targets even more effective. Medieval interiors were full of soft barriers that modern people often overlook. Heavy wool clothing, blankets, bed hangings, tapestries, curtains, padded garments, furs, and even straw-filled bedding all helped preserve heat close to the body. Wealthier households used wall hangings not only for decoration but also to soften the cold of stone walls and reduce drafts. Beds with curtains created their own insulated pockets of air. A person sleeping in a curtained bed, wrapped in wool and fur, was not exposed to the full chill of the room. Even in simpler homes, cloth mattered enormously. It turned shelter into warmth. And warmth in the Middle Ages was always personal. People did not walk around lightly dressed indoors in winter. They layered clothing constantly. Linen undergarments, wool tunics, cloaks, hoods, leg wrappings, and caps all worked together with the house itself. The building gave protection, but clothing completed the system. If we imagine medieval people inside their homes dressed as we dress in centrally heated apartments, the whole picture becomes distorted. Their comfort came from the partnership between architecture, fire, fabric, and behavior. Behavior may be the most overlooked factor of all. Medieval homes stayed warm because the people inside knew how to live in them. Fires were managed carefully. Embers were banked under ash to survive the night. Fuel was conserved and used deliberately. Doors were not thrown open casually every few minutes. Work was organized around light, warmth, and necessity. Meals were planned around the hearth. Sleeping arrangements were practical, often communal. In some households, animals were sheltered very close by, sometimes even within the same structure or in adjoining spaces, contributing body heat to the building. This seems alien to modern sensibilities, but in a hard winter, practicality outranked privacy. That constant use mattered. A medieval house in winter was rarely a cold shell that had to be heated from nothing every day. It was often a continuously warmish environment, never luxurious, but not dead cold either. Fires might be reduced, but not fully lost. Warmth from cooking lingered. Bodies remained inside for long stretches. Bedding retained heat. Walls and furnishings dried and warmed. Over time, the house itself became conditioned by occupation. That matters more than we think. An inhabited house behaves differently from an empty one. Even the darkness of medieval interiors had a purpose. Small windows meant less light, yes, but also less heat loss. Glass was expensive and uncommon in ordinary homes for much of the medieval period, so openings had to be minimized or covered with shutters, cloth, parchment, or oiled material. This kept out wind and cold. Medieval people accepted dimness as a fair price for retaining warmth. Today, we often prioritize openness and daylight. They prioritized survival. Their choices make more sense when judged by their winters, not by our preferences. And then there is the question of smoke, which modern viewers tend to treat as proof that medieval homes must have been unbearable. Certainly, smoke could be irritating and unhealthy, especially in houses without chimneys. But it also did things people valued. It drifted upward, helping warm the interior volume. It dried the roof timbers and thatch. It could discourage insects and help preserve hanging food. Over time, builders improved smoke control with louvres, roof vents, and chimneys. But even earlier smoky interiors were not simply design failures, they were compromise solutions in a world where complete efficiency was impossible and every benefit had a cost. Of course, not every medieval home was warm. Poverty changed everything. A badly built hut with poor maintenance, little fuel, and damp bedding could be miserable beyond anything most people today experience. A widow with no firewood, a leaking roof, and a weak body in midwinter was in real danger. Regional differences mattered too. A well-built timber house in one place could be far more comfortable than a damp stone dwelling in another. Social class mattered. Access to wood, peat, cloth, labor, and repairs mattered. So the story is not that all medieval homes were cozy. It is that many were far more thermally intelligent than we assume. What makes the subject so fascinating is that medieval warmth did not come from one secret trick. It came from a whole way of thinking. Build smaller, build thicker, let less heat escape, use fire constantly but carefully, sleep in layers, warm the people, not the empty space. Use cloth to trap air, accept darkness, respect fuel, live close together. Turn the house into a managed winter habitat rather than a decorated box. It was not glamorous, but it worked. And perhaps the most surprising part is this. Some of the very signs we read today as proof of hardship were, in fact, signs of thermal wisdom. The dark room, the tiny window, the low roof, the straw above, the animals nearby, the smoke in the rafters, the bed with curtains, the family gathered tightly around one fire. All of it formed a system, crude in appearance, yes, but not random. These homes were shaped by generations of people who had watched winter test every weak idea and destroy every foolish design. That is why the real mystery is not how medieval people survived the cold. The real mystery is how much knowledge was hidden inside houses we now dismiss as primitive. Because once you step past the image of the freezing peasant hut and begin to ask how heat was actually trapped, preserved, shared, and lived with, another question appears. If the roof was heavy with snow, the walls were made of earth and timber, and the only obvious heat source was a modest fire. Then what happened on the very coldest nights? When the wind cut harder, the fuel stack ran lower, and a single mistake in how the house was used could turn warmth into something far more dangerous. On the coldest nights of the medieval winter, warmth became a kind of discipline. It was not enough for a house to be well built, it had to be used correctly. A family might have thick walls, a decent roof, and a reliable hearth, but if the fire was badly managed, if fuel was wasted too early in the evening, if bedding had gone damp, or if winter stores had been misjudged, the entire balance inside the home could begin to fail. That is what makes medieval domestic life so compelling. Warmth was never guaranteed by the building alone. It depended on a chain of small decisions, each one easy to overlook, but together they made the difference between endurance and misery. This is where fuel becomes one of the hidden protagonists of the story. When we imagine warmth, we imagine heat. Medieval people often imagined fuel first. Firewood had to be gathered, cut, dried, stacked, protected, rationed, and understood. Wet wood smoked badly and burned poorly. Good hardwood burned longer and gave more stable heat than brush or softwood. Peat, where available, offered another option, and in some places charcoal, dried dung, or agricultural waste helped stretch limited supplies. But fuel was never infinite. A medieval household could not simply turn up the heat because the weather worsened. Every piece of fuel burned too quickly in early winter was a piece missing later when snow still lay thick and spring felt impossibly far away. That scarcity taught people how to stretch warmth across time. Fires were not always kept blazing high. They were controlled, banked, fed in ways that matched need. Embers might be covered with ash overnight so that enough life remained in them to restart the fire at dawn. This saved labor and tinder, but it also preserved continuity. A house that never truly lost its fire had an enormous advantage over one that had to begin from cold each morning. In a sense, warmth was stored not only in walls and bedding, but in the coals themselves, sleeping under ash while the household slept nearby. And those sleeping arrangements mattered more than modern people often realize. Medieval sleep in winter was less about individual comfort than thermal strategy. Beds were smaller than many modern beds, partly because people often slept in semi-reclined positions, but also because enclosed sleeping spaces held warmth better. Curtains around the bed helped trap heat. Straw mattresses, feather beds where available, wool blankets, animal skins, and layered coverings created a warm shell around the body. Multiple people might share warmth, whether children together or entire families in close sleeping arrangements. From a modern perspective, that may seem cramped. From a medieval one, shared warmth was a resource. Empty space was the real luxury, and luxury was not always useful in January. What is fascinating is how often medieval solutions revolved around controlling air. Warmth is not just about fire, it is about preventing warm air from being stolen. Drafts were the enemy. A house could be reasonably heated and still feel unbearable if cold air moved through it constantly. So builders minimized openings, positioned doors carefully, and used screens, shutters, cloth hangings, or furniture to interrupt direct flows of air. In larger houses, the entrance might open into a passage rather than directly into the main living space, reducing the shock of wind entering every time the door opened. In smaller homes, even the arrangement of benches, chests, or partitions could help create protected pockets where people sat, worked, and slept. This is one reason medieval interiors often seemed cluttered to modern eyes. The clutter was functional, chests were storage, but they were also barriers. Textiles decorated, but they also insulated. Wooden furniture occupied space, but it also shaped the movement of air and heat. Rushes or straw on the floor were not only there to soften the ground, they also provided a degree of insulation. Underfoot and absorbed some moisture. The house was being constantly adjusted through its contents. Warmth was architectural, but it was also domestic, woven into the ordinary placement of things. Moisture was another enemy, perhaps even worse than cold by itself. A dry, cold room is one thing. A damp, cold room feels far more brutal. Medieval people understood this well, even if not in scientific terms. Damp bedding, damp walls, damp clothes, and damp floors could make a home feel impossible to warm. This is where the fire's role went beyond temperature. It dried what winter tried to saturate. Clothing hung near the hearth, rushes were changed, leaks were patched, and the interior had to be kept as dry as circumstances allowed. Smoke, for all its faults, helped with this too, moving upward into rafters and roofing materials, reducing rot and discouraging some forms of decay. A warm medieval home was rarely just hot. It was dry enough to stay livable. The placement of the home in the landscape also shaped winter comfort. Medieval builders rarely had the freedom to build wherever they wished, but within their possibilities, they often chose wisely. A house sheltered from prevailing winds by a slope, hedge, wall, or neighboring structure performed better than one exposed in open ground. Good drainage mattered. A slightly raised site could keep the house drier and therefore warmer. The orientation of the doorway, the exposure to sunlight, the proximity of barns or other outbuildings, all of this influenced how the house behaved in winter. We tend to think of warmth as something created indoors, but much of it began outdoors, in choices made before the first wall was ever raised. Then there is the question of animals, one of the most misunderstood features of pre-modern life. In many places, animals were housed close to humans, sometimes under the same roof or in immediately adjoining spaces. To modern people, this sounds like filth and inconvenience, and certainly it came with smells, noise, and health risks. But it also came with heat. A cow, a goat, or several sheep represented not just wealth or food, but a source of body warmth within the winter structure. Medieval households did not separate thermal logic from agricultural logic. If the arrangement helped both survival and livestock protection, it made sense. The house, the stable, and the family economy were often more interconnected than we imagine. Even cooking had thermal intelligence. Preparing food on the hearth did more than feed the household. It released steam, heat, and long periods of controlled fire. Large pots left simmering for hours created a stable warmth. Baking, brewing, heating water, drying grains, rendering fat, all of these tasks added to the thermal life of the house. The kitchen in modern homes is often just one room among others. In a medieval house, the act of making food could be central to keeping the whole space alive. Heat was not compartmentalized into separate systems. It flowed through daily life. This integrated way of living helps explain why medieval warmth could feel surprisingly resilient despite limited technology. The house worked because everything in it participated. The roof trapped heat, the walls slowed loss, the hearth generated warmth, the fuel strategy extended it, the textiles held it close, the beds concentrated it, the people and animals added to it, the routines protected it. Remove one part and the system weakened. Remove several, and winter became dangerous very quickly. And danger was always near. This is important because it keeps us from romanticizing the medieval home as some lost art of cozy perfection. The same fire that warmed a family could also fill the room with dangerous smoke or set the roof ablaze. The same low ventilation that preserved heat could worsen illness. The same packed sleeping arrangements that conserved warmth could spread disease. A thatched roof insulated beautifully, but once ignited, it could destroy an entire household in minutes. Medieval comfort was never innocent. It was negotiated with risk at every step. This is especially true in larger homes and elite residences, where modern audiences often assume conditions must have been dramatically better. In some ways they were. More fuel, better materials, separate chambers, improved fireplaces, glazed windows in certain cases, servants to manage fires and bedding. But larger buildings had their own problems. Great halls were notoriously difficult to heat because their size swallowed warmth. High ceilings let heat rise far above the occupied zone. Stone walls could remain cold for long periods. That is why comfort in castles and manor houses often concentrated in smaller private chambers rather than the grand public rooms. Wealth could buy more fire and more fabric, but it could not completely defeat the physics of large cold spaces. The medieval solution, once again, was not to heat everything. Equally, it was to create habitable centers. A lord might dine in the hall, but retreat to a chamber layered with hangings, cushions, thick bedding, shutters, and a fireplace where warmth could be held more effectively. A peasant did much the same in humbler form around the central hearth. Across class lines, the principle repeated, real warmth lived in enclosed, used, protected spaces, and perhaps that is the deepest lesson hidden in these winter homes. Medieval people did not win against cold by eliminating it. They won by narrowing it. They reduced the part of life exposed to winter. They pulled activity inward. They thickened boundaries. They gathered heat around bodies, beds, food, animals, and work. They accepted that some parts of the home would remain cooler, dimmer, rougher. They did not demand perfect comfort. They secured enough comfort where it counted most. Seen that way, the snow on the roof becomes almost symbolic. To us, it looks like proof of bitter exposure. To them, it may have signaled that the house was doing its job. The warmth was staying below, the cold was being held above, and between those two worlds stood a structure built from memory, compromise, and centuries of observation. Medieval homes were not magical. They leaked, smoked, smelled, and sometimes failed catastrophically. But many of them also embodied a practical intelligence that modern people, used to outsourced heat and sealed buildings, no longer instinctively recognize. So why did medieval homes stay warm even when snow covered the roof? Because warmth was never just a fire in the middle of a room. It was a complete system of building, clothing, sleeping, storing, burning, layering, arranging, and living. It was in the thatch and in the wool, in the ash-covered embers and the bed curtains, in the small windows and the thick walls, in the family gathered close and the fuel kept dry, in the constant effort to make a hostile season manageable. That is the truth hidden behind the image of the frozen medieval village. Inside those dark little houses, winter had not been defeated, but it had been outsmarted.